Okay, so just to go over a really quick review of the previous concepts, you guys talked about just the basic idea of cultural weed control, and that it is an integration of farm management practices, basically just to improve or to create maximum weed suppression. So you're going to use multiple different types of practices across your field, soil management, crop management, density management, that sort of thing, to basically control for your weeds. You're not going to be using things like tillage. You're not going to be using, mechanical or biological practices. These are more just type of basic ideas across your field that you're going to use to control it for your weeds, while also trying to enhance for the best production of your crop, or the highest yielding conditions for your crop. You guys talked about new weed communities and how those become established. They can become established by cropping practices, which are biological pressures. So how would the type of crops that you plant, or the way that you guys plant, have biological pressures on the weeds? How might that affect the weed community across your field? Yeah?
The spacing between the rows, and if you can make it narrow, it can shade out weeds. It can also increase the susceptibility of spreading diseases.
Very true, very true. Anybody else have any other ideas besides changing the cropping density across your field? No? Yep. Megan? Exactly. Yep. So definitely the type of crop that you're planting, the cultivar of the plant that you're using, also has a really big impact. Tillage practices are more of a physical pressure. So the type of tillage that you're using, if you're doing moldboard plow or disc plowing, how often you go and you till throughout your field, that's also going to have an effect. On the previous weed community, so this weed seed bank and weeds that have been there in the present, if they're annuals versus perennials, that's going to have an effect on the makeup of your weed community, as well as the herbicide history that you guys have been using. So the type of herbicides that you use, how often you've been using them, and selectivity. So if you're using something that is a very broad spectrum herbicide, which is going to kill as many weeds as possible, that could have an effect as well. And you might end up having weeds that can develop resistance, which is something that you want to always be concerned about. So also, cultural weed practices are, their primary focus is basically to impact the crop. It's not really supposed to be, your number one focus when you're thinking about cultural control is not necessarily the weeds. You're doing these practices and making these changes to create a better growing environment for your crop. And it just so happens that along the way, you are also controlling for your weeds. And it's important to know that these cultural impacts, they have a long-term effects, and that basically you're going to be using these practices to create a more sustainable use of your resources across the field by your crop. And by that, in understanding that it is a long-term effect, you'll have more sustainable control of your weeds. Any questions before we kind of move on from that review? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Okay, so let's talk about some crop competition enhancement, which is maybe one of the bigger things about cultural control of your weeds. Some things that you're going to take into consideration when you want to create a better competitor with your crop is the choice of the cultivars that you're going to be using. Some are more hardy to your environment that you're growing in. Others might be more disease resistant. You could have, say, a taller crop, or you might have larger leaved crop, which is going to create a denser canopy, or you might have a crop that's higher yielding, and that might be your main focus. So those are things to take into consideration. We'll talk a little bit about crop rotation strategies, and we'll also talk about cover crops and smother crops. Why do you guys think that crop rotation might be important when you're thinking about cultural control of weeds? Yep, Stephen.
Rotating the crop throws off the niche for the weeds.
Yep.
So perennials per se.
Great. Yeah, that's the basic concept between crop rotations, that you're trying to, make these weeds go off kilter. You're trying to keep the environment continually changing so that they don't get used to a certain growing environment or a certain situation. Why might cover crops or smother crops be helpful? Yeah.
Does that require any chemical additions?
Yeah.
Does that also also productive in terms of organic matter and preventing soil erosion.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so cover crops and smother crops, they're not only going to be, keeping weeds out of your field, but they're also going to be benefiting your crop environment by adding organic material, using different nutrients and putting them back into the soil. Also, agronomic practices are really important, so you might want to have an early establishment of your crop. Or you might want to delay the fertilizer or the organic amendments that you're going to be applying to your field. Why might you want to delay nutrient amendments to your field? We kind of talked about this a little bit in my lab when we went out to the field. Megan?
You want to delay your nutrient applications until it's at the point where your crop is going to have the best chance of uptake.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's not a good competitor at that time, then you're actually getting the weeds instead of the crop.
Exactly, exactly. And then we talked about a little bit about cropping density and increasing cropping density and establishing an earlier canopy so that germinating weed seeds would be affected by the far light and red light conditions. Also, anthropogenic crop manipulation. We're talking here about cropping density, a little bit relating back to inter-row spacing and that sort of thing. So we want to talk about inter-row spacing or intra-row spacing. So how many plants are within a row, or how close are your rows spaced together within a field. You're also going to talk about or think about your crop genotype. So this would be looking at plant breeding or using biotechnology to kind of create a different cultivar or look for different cultivars that would be helpful. And you also want to think about your planting dates, so either delaying the planting of your crop or having it be earlier, and then also looking at basing the planting of your crop based upon the emergence of your weed seeds to give that advantage to your crop over the weeds. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about crop rotation strategies. So crop rotation, as we kind of talked about already, is basically you're going to create a regime where you're going to replace crops every year, or you're going to create kind of a pattern of the different crops that you're going to use over the course of, say, 5 or 10 years or 3 years. So over the course of multiple years, you're going to be replacing each crop every year and kind of creating that off balance for the weeds so they don't get used to a certain crop, so monocropping, or get used to a certain environment that they're growing in. This has been historically important. It's often been used in the development of agriculture, as well as is important for very low input systems. And it is also an important aid to weed management. So the component of, it's part of your weed management strategy rather than being a number one strategy itself. So some primary values about crop rotation. We think about crop rotation for soil fertility management. We want to also improve crop disease control. So looking at different diseases, or trying to keep diseases also off kilter along with your weeds. We want to reduce soil erosion, as we were saying before. Help improve the crop yield and quality. How might crop rotation improve crop yield and quality? How might that happen? Megan?
If you rotate the crop, you break the disease cycle.
Mm-hmm.
One crop's another, you have less disease.
Mm-hmm.
And the crops will have different nutrient requirements, so they won't be feeding on the same nutrients.
Right, exactly. Say if you've planted a legume in your crop or in your field before you've planted corn, there most likely will be a better nitrogen supply for your corn that year after having been grown after a legume. And also it's important for weed management, as we've been talking throughout this lecture. So diversity is key. So you want to think about crop diversity in means of keeping your weeds off kilter. Think about investing in the economic investing. You don't want to put all of your investments into one single stock or into one single mutual fund. You want to kind of spread it out, over across many different stocks or many different bonds and different options. And the same with picking classes. You don't necessarily want to have to take all crop and soil science classes, or you don't want to have to take all horticulture classes. You want to kind of broaden your spectrum and maybe dabble a little bit in engineering or somewhere in the arts and sciences to kind of give you a little bit more of, more broader depth education. And it's also, diversity is important in terms of morphology and phenology. Why might differences in morphology be important? Anthony, why do you think morphology differences would be important when it comes to crop rotation? We're talking here about, say, the makeup of your plant or the architecture of your plant. So leaf shape, development of the plant, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. You can definitely have that. You want to look at your leaf architecture depending upon what types of, density you want to be growing at or what type of canopy you want to develop. Why might phenology or the history or growing pattern of a plant be important? We're talking here possibly about the growth habit, so annual, biennial, or perennial, and then also the pattern that it grows throughout the year. So does it germinate early? Does it germinate later? How does the growing pattern or how quickly the crop grows affect what might be happening with the weeds? Basically here what you're going to think about in terms of phenology is that if you're going to be having a late germinating crop, you're going to want to be timing or understanding that and relating it back to the timing of when you're going to be planting your crop. I love how enthusiastic you guys are this morning. It's so great. Okay, so our first figure. Here this is looking at the different types of crop rotation and how it has had an effect on the number of weed species that are occurring throughout a field. So you had three different types of crops. You had barley, corn, and beans, and then they looked at 4 different weed species and counted the number of the weed species that occurred within an area of a field. And this happened over a 3-year sequence. And so what do you guys what's the pattern that's developing here that you guys can see from the data?
Corn is very good at suppressing weeds.
Yeah, that's definitely occurring too. Mm-hmm. What else is kind of happening?
General total weeds going down.
Yeah, exactly. Over the course of the year, there's a decreasing trend for each of the 4 species. If you look at the total number of weeds that happened in the beginning with barley, and then you look at the end when you're growing in beans, it basically is an overall decrease in what you're seeing. And yeah, like Anthony was saying, corn is pretty bad at suppressing weeds. It didn't really help all that well at using corn or seeing when corn was grown beforehand. Didn't really do all that great of a job at suppressing. Okay, this study here was over the course of 5 years, so from 1965 to 1970, and it looked at differences between either monocropping or crop rotations. And you'll see that numbers 1 through 3 were in monocrops of either corn, soybeans, or wheat. And then 4 and 5 were instances of different types of crop rotation. And then they looked here at 5 different weed species. And looking at the percentage of change of the number of the total seed composition within your soil. So what are we seeing that the trends are here? This is kind of a harder figure, I find, to exactly understand what's going on. Stephen.
Buckwheat wasn't very good at improving its presence in the field unless it was already high and just didn't increase. But whereas something like foxtail, just kept more and more into the field.
That's definitely a good trend. I didn't notice that before. But yeah, giant foxtail didn't really take into consideration, it didn't really matter whether it was a monocropping or if it was in crop rotation. It kind of, for the most part, during the monocropping of either the corn or soybeans, it increased its population very high. But when you look at it at the crop rotation in 4 and 5, it definitely had a bit of a decrease here. And that's also kind of happening with the other weed species as well. You have sort of an overall increase in your weed population with the first few years within the monocropping systems. And then if you take a look at the 2 rotation systems, you have much more lower seed composition within your soil. So this is telling us that basically monocropping sometimes might be helpful, but the most part, it's not going to do very well at suppressing the weed seed bank. Whereas if you're using this rotation system of 3 types of crops or even 4, or leaving your field fallow for a certain time period, you're going to have a much decrease in your seed soil population, or your soil seed bank. Or at least if you do have a slight increase, it's not going to be as much as it would, say, within a monocropping system. So that kind of makes sense to everybody? Bob, you're looking a little perplexed.
It's a terrible chart.
I agree. I'm not going to lie.
So that, just to understand the axis, it says percent change on the vertical axis.
Uh-huh.
So there's a 1,300% change for giant foxtail.
So that basically means that, yeah, that it increased like 13-fold. Yeah, from the starting point to the end of when they stopped the experiment in 1970, that there was an overall 130 times increase in the seed soil bank as there was in the beginning. I find that the negative change is sometimes kind of a little confusing to grasp around. So if there's this negative change, that means that there was indeed a decrease. And I found that it was kind of interesting that with the continuous corn for crabgrass, it actually had a slight decrease in the soil seed bank. So I found that was interesting. Yeah.
So that's over a 5-year period then?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And each of the 5 systems were just grown by themselves. So say system 5 was for 5 years, system 1 was for 5 years.
I'd also imagine any change in weed population is not solely due to whether it's being grown in continuous corn, soybean, wheat, or in multi-crop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like things like...
Practices are going to have big influences on whether you get a 1,300% increase in giant foxtail.
Are those by percentages?
Yeah.
Percentage.
Yeah. So it's percent change. So you're going to have either 100% change, which basically means, say you start with 10 seed in your soil, and you, like later, 5 years later, you have 100 seeds in your soil. So it increases
So
by...
wouldn't it be important if it's percent change, like wouldn't it be really critical to know what the starting amount was?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well-
because if it increases like 13-fold, but there's only 1 seed to begin with, then you have 13 seeds in the end. But if you
That's
start
very
with
true.
100 seeds and it only changes by 1%, you still have more seeds.
Yeah, so that is kind of difficult. You can't really compare, it almost seems, you can't really compare the 5 species like with one another. Stephen and then Megan.
There's also the question, like if the weed was already present in a very large amount, but that number just didn't change,
Mm-hmm.
then it would come up as near 0, but that still doesn't mean that the
Right.
cropping system's capable of controlling that weed.
This
So-
also accounts for drops, negative percentages too, so it's showing the effect on seeding now. It's not quantity.
Exactly. So besides getting beyond the point that this is probably a bad chart and a bad way to present this information because it was presented in 1973 and this is now 2008, the concept still lies true that monocropping systems generally are not going to be all that great at suppressing the soil seed bank.
It's always going to want to know on the exam.
Exactly. Whereas with crop rotation, basically is going to be much better at suppressing the weed soil seed bank.
Say that and take that chart out.
Exactly.
We'll always chart and explain what's going on.
Okay. But I saw this when I was going through the lecture, and I saw this chart, and I thought that it was, not the best chart myself. But I put it still in here so that we could have this dialogue and have this discussion of what is this chart really trying to get at? Why is it bad? How might we present the information in a different manner? Still getting at the same concept. Okay, moving on to the next chart. This one is a little bit better, but still presented by the same people. So, all right, again, we have the percent change. We have a positive and negative percent change. It's from 1953 to 1962, so over a 5-year period. And we're now just looking at these weed species all grown under a vegetable cropping system. So, as we're seeing here that in vegetable crops, when you're using a vegetable rotation system, that you're going to have a decrease in most of your weed species, except for things like shepherd's purse, except for fulmatory, annual bluegrass, and common chickweed. As well as groundsel. Okay.
Is that in the sign by the speed wall?
I'm sorry?
The speed wall,
Infinity.
the bottom dropped out of the
Yeah, I don't really know what happened there. That was pretty, that's, it, I'm guessing that it would had a percent change that was much larger than 1,000%, negative 1,000% change. So we'll just move on. Okay. So then looking at this last chart here, this was in 1988, so a little bit farther before or a little bit after 1970 and all those charts. They've put their act together. They understand how to make some graphs a little bit more interesting. So here we're looking at either continuous maize, so a corn monocropping, or we're looking at a corn wheat rotation here. And then at this first figure, figure A, they used either just no herbicides or they did apply herbicides. What is this chart saying in terms of seed density? What can you guys observe from chart A or figure A? Yeah, exactly, Colin. Yeah, that's really good. So it's basically showing that when you had your rotation, no matter if you applied herbicides or not, you still kind of got the exact same amount of weed seed density control. Whereas if you were growing in a monocropping, it was most essential to use that herbicide. What about down here in figure B, where it does not use any herbicides at all, and it's just looking at plant density across either the comparing the monocropping or the rotation? Kind of the same concept as Colin said, that the rotation is better at controlling the weeds or decreasing that plant density rather than monocropping. Pretty easy concepts. Okay, let's move on to intercropping. So intercropping is basically the concept of growing different crops in the same field at the same time. So you could have multiple different patterns. You can either grow the same crop in the same, or multiple crops in one row, or you can have corn be a border to a vegetable crop in the center. You can get really fancy and design different intercropping systems. This is really good for small-scale agriculture and agriculture that's not going to be using too much mechanical control. So really important in areas such as developing nations, small-scale vegetable farms, or small-scale organic farms. And then we want to talk about, too, the niche differentiation concept. So this is basically thinking or going along the concept of if you're using intercrops, that the whole concept is that you have two plants that are occupying the same area, but that they're using two different niches, that their niches aren't going to completely overlap with one another. And that's why intercropping can be successful. So it's either completely defying or it's completely using to the extreme the one species, one niche concept. Do you guys remember what that concept was, one species, one niche, from your prelim beforehand? I know we talked about this in the review class that I had. Basically, it's the concept that you are only able to have one plant species or one animal species occupy one specific niche, and that you're going to have competitors try to enter that niche system by competing with the number one species that is within that niche, and that's why you have competition. Okay. Also, in terms of niche differentiation, you want to be able to use resources more efficiently. So intercropping, because you have these two species that are occupying two niches but within the same area, they're able to use the resources of that field or of that plot area more efficiently than one species would, because their niches are slightly different than one another. So you might be growing corn with, say, a legume of some sort. The legume isn't going to need as much nitrogen because it's a nitrogen fixer, but because it is fixing nitrogen, it's going to give a supply to the corn that's growing within the same area. So you are able to use those soil nutrients in a more efficient way than you normally would if you're growing corn in a monocropping system. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Cool. Okay. You also want to think about, in terms of intercropping, the differential utilization of nitrogen. So like I just said, growing legumes with a non-leguminous crop. So talking possibly about corn and clover or corn and alfalfa. So using nitrogen in different ways, but still being able to use that nutrient to its maximum capacity. You also want to think about the differential utilization of light. So this is talking about developing two types of canopy structures within the same area. So growing a shade-tolerant, low-growing species with a sun-loving or sun-requiring plant species that can grow very tall. A good example would be, say, beans and cassava. Other examples, do you guys know of other examples where you would want to grow, say, a short plant along with a tall plant, besides corn and clover, or corn and alfalfa, or beans and cassava?
Coffee,
And,
a tall plant.
yeah, in Mexico, they grow coffee along with a lot of different tree species, so like berry crops, or not necessarily berry crops, but like cacao and stuff like that. So, good example. Okay. Here we're looking at weed biomass here over on the right-hand scale. It's in kilograms. And then we're looking at 3 different intercropping systems that happen throughout a season. And the white section is looking at barley just by itself, or barley grown with red clover. And you're using those 3 systems consecutively throughout the 3 seasons here. So what are we seeing? What's the change in biomass that we're seeing based upon the 2 different cropping systems? Stephen.
If it's barley alone, then weeds are allowed to break away as time passes. But if it's barley with red clover, they maintain a pretty steady hold.
Yep.
Over.
Mm-hmm.
Does that change generally?
What did you say?
Is that going to be attributed to the fact that the red clover is going to occupy dish that the weeds otherwise?
Exactly. Yep. That's going to move into what we're going to talk about in a moment here, talking about cover crops and some other crops. We're growing the barley, but the red clover is indeed occupying that area that weeds would normally take over, that interspacing between the crop rows. Okay, this is a pretty in-depth and confusing figure, but it makes sense once I explain it. Each of these models represents a different replacement series, and you're growing 2 different species within the same area, and it's looking at how, based upon the type of species that you have growing together, so types of intercropping systems, you can have different growth situations occur. In this first graph here, you'll see that plant A and plant B have the same amount of impact on one another as they do on themselves. So plant A is just as good of a competitor with plant B as plant B is as good of a competitor with plant A. So this is an example where you would have intercropping. The 2 plants are able to grow with one another successfully, and they can still produce a pretty good yield. Examples in model 2A and then 2B are examples where either A is a better competitor or B is a better competitor. So you're going to have in section 2A, you're going to have A is outcompeting plant B, whereas in section 2B, you're going to have B is outcompeting plant A. So here, this is what we call the Montgomery effect, where you have a competitor that is outcompeting another plant, but yet it has the same amount of competition with itself. Okay. Model 3 here, you have a decrease on both species. So plant A is having a negative effect on plant B, and vice versa. Plant B is having a negative effect on plant A. But both of the plants themselves, both species, don't have an effect on itself. What type of situation might you have where you are a plant and you are affecting your neighbor, but you're not affecting yourself? Megan?
Buckwheat, because it's allelopathic, so it could just
Exactly.
cycle of another.
Yep. So model 3 is an example of allelopathy. So you're creating a toxin, or you're creating some sort of chemical that is going to affect your neighboring plant, whereas you're not going to affect yourself at all. Okay. And then model 4 is the exact opposite of model 3. You can grow pretty well by yourself, but you need, say if you're plant A, you need plant B to grow more efficiently. What type of growth pattern or what type of situation would this be? Mutualism. Mm-hmm, exactly. So this is symbiosis. So, okay. talking about cover crops. We've already kind of gone into cover crops a little bit. So cover crops are basically the use of a mixed stand of an annual or a perennial herbaceous plant to cover the soil when either the crop is not persistent in the field or present in the field. So this is instead of letting your field grow fallow, you're going to put something in there and try to use nutrients or keep the weeds at bay. So for cover crops, you normally want to plant it after the harvest of your primary crop. You're going to cover crops are going to cover the soil throughout the entire fallow period. And cover crops might be able to be used as an intercrop, or they can be used within a rotation plan and planted by themselves. So as Ben was saying, you might use the red clover in the figure with the barley. That was being used as a cover crop because it was grown along with the harvested crop, but it was also smothering out the weeds. Some good examples here are rye, vetch, and different clovers. Do any of you guys use cover crops? If you guys have farms, do you use them on your own farms? Yeah, Megan. What do you guys use?
We don't use vetch because it's really invasive and it's kind of a mess.
Yeah.
We use clover because we produce clover seeds.
Uh-huh.
So we get an economic
Get it kind of like
advantage of producing clover because we harvest the seed. We don't just plow it under.
good call. Ben?
We sow rye in the row middles and the vineyards.
Okay.
When we plant them, first couple years, then we usually stay.
Good call. Do you guys use the rye at all for anything? Like, do you harvest it at all? Okay. Good call. And Emily, what do you guys use? Or Aaron? Okay. Good call. Excellent. So do you guys know what a smother crop is besides looking at it up there? We kind of already talked about this with the red clover. So smother crops are used to reduce weed populations within your field. And they generally don't require any sort of herbicide inputs. They're very minimal to maintain. They don't really require a whole lot of inputs. And you would generally remove the smother crop before you go and you plant in your crop in the spring. A good example of this would be alfalfa. Okay. And then we have also some examples. 3 other examples of cover crops include living mulch, just regular mulches, and then green manure. Living mulch is plants that are intercropped with your primary crop. So the example there was the barley and the red clover. These are generally well established when your crop emerges. So the living mulches are something that you would plant after your harvest in the fall, and they're going to grow throughout the winter. So winter wheat might be an example, and then it's already established so that when you go and when you plant your corn or you plant something else in the springtime, it's already established when that primary crop is emerging. Example of this could be corn grown in clover over the winter. A mulch is different from a living mulch because this is something that you're going to apply to your field separately, and generally the residues are left on the top or at least near the soil surface of your field. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a cover crop. It could, where you could till under your cover crop before going and planting in your primary crop. Or it could be, say, some sort of organic amendment that you would bring in from an outside source, which I'm sure you guys all know about. And then our last example here is green manure, which is a type of cover crop that is incorporated into the soil and used specifically for its organic amendments to help with soil fertility. So green manure is going to be a little bit different than your mulch because you're going to actually be incorporating it into your soil, and it generally is something that you would have already grown on your field beforehand. Do you guys have any examples of what, say, a green manure or a living mulch might be? Aaron, good winter wheat. Yeah, Megan?
Like barley. So you use kind of barley.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And plant beans.
Good call. Excellent. Does anybody have any questions on cover crop usage and cover crops in general? Cool. That is it.